Gemini, someone you love is pulling away, and you haven't even noticed. Gemini, there's something whispering beneath the surface of your days. Something you felt, but haven't quite named. And this time, it's not a flicker of thought or a sudden inspiration. It's someone close to your heart quietly pulling away. Their footsteps haven't echoed yet. Their distance hasn't shouted. But the silence is growing, isn't it? A pause where there once was laughter. A delay where once you shared everything. This is not an easy truth to hear. But sometimes love's most honest moments come wrapped in stillness. You, Gemini, are a communicator. A seeker of new horizons. A heart that moves fast and thinks faster. But in the blur of keeping everything spinning, something precious has begun to unravel. Not because you meant to neglect it, but because you thought connection could hold itself together like wind in motion. Today, we're going to look gently and courageously at what's happening beneath the surface. This isn't about blame. It's about awakening. About noticing the subtle signs before it's too late to respond with the authenticity your soul longs for. So, take a breath with me now. Open not just your ears, but your heart. And if these words resonate, let yourself be seen by this community. Hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the Esoteric Wisdom channel, where truth, healing, and transformation are always invited in. Let's begin. Gate 1. The invisible shift. When emotional distance begins in silence. Gemini, your world is often a beautiful whirlwind of thoughts, words, ideas, and curiosity. You are someone who dances through conversations, who connects dots others don't even see, and who breathes life into dull rooms with your wit and insight. But even the brightest mind can sometimes miss the quietest signal. And what you've been missing is someone slowly stepping back from your life. This emotional retreat didn't begin with a fight. It didn't arrive as a storm. No shouting, no slammed doors, just the soft fading of attention. The missed call that doesn't get returned right away. The message that once came with emojis and inside jokes, now just seen. The long dinners that now feel shorter, colder, more distracted. And you, always trying to make sense of it logically, may have brushed it off as stress, as coincidence, or something temporary. Maybe they're just busy. Maybe they need space. You reason your way through the discomfort, but beneath the logic, your intuition, the emotional antenna you don't always trust, was trying to speak. Something has changed. Gemini, let's be real. One of your deepest fears is boredom. Another is confinement. So you often move quickly, scanning for stimulation, solutions, something new. But when someone you love is quietly hurting, quietly withdrawing, it doesn't show up in dramatic ways. It shows up in subtle silence. And unfortunately, you're most likely to miss that kind of signal. Because silence rarely stimulates the mind, it just confuses the heart. Let's look at why this is happening, not just from their side, but from yours. Because healing starts not with blame, but with understanding. The person pulling away from you is not doing so because you are unlovable or because you failed. Quite the opposite. They likely still love you very deeply, but they are starving for emotional depth. And for all your brilliance, depth is not the place you've been willing to go lately, especially not with them. Why? Because vulnerability, true vulnerability, feels dangerous. It feels like pausing your performance. It means showing the messy parts you usually talk your way around. It means not having the clever answer, the intellectual insight, or the right words. And that, for someone like you, can feel terrifying. You see, Gemini, sometimes your ability to talk about everything keeps you from feeling anything fully. And that's what this person senses. They aren't leaving because you said the wrong thing. They're leaving because you said everything except the real thing. Take, for example, Rachel, a Gemini woman I work with who had a long-term partner named Lucas. She was a queen of keeping things light and fun. Every disagreement turned into a joke. Every tear Lucas shed was met with logic and rational comfort instead of emotional support. Over time, Lucas stopped talking about his fears, his dreams, even his day. He stopped reaching out. And one day, he simply said, "I don't feel seen anymore." Rachel was shocked. "But I was always there," she cried. And she was physically, socially, intellectually, but not emotionally. She had built a beautiful bridge of words between them, but forgot to actually walk across it into his heart. Gemini, I'm not telling you this to shame you. I'm telling you this to wake you, because you might be living a similar story right now. You might be with someone who still loves you, but who has stopped trying to connect. Not because they don't care, but because they no longer believe you'll meet them halfway. In truth, in emotional nakedness, in mutual silence where even pain is allowed to exist. Geminis often have a childhood history of being praised for their words and intelligence, but not always for their emotions. Some learned early on to perform rather than to feel, to charm rather than to reveal. So you became good at being liked. But now, someone you love doesn't want you to be liked. They want you to be real. And you can be. You absolutely can. But first you must recognize the cost of staying on the surface. Because while it protects you from mess, it also protects you from meaning. There's a point in every relationship, romantic or platonic, when a connection must deepen or dissolve. The crossroads is here. And if you keep floating above it, you'll lose the one person who longed to meet you below. You may wonder, how do I go deeper when I've never learned how? The answer is simpler than you think. You start small, with honesty, with the sentence, I feel scared to say this, but I want to try. You don't need to be poetic. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be sincere. You might say, I've been feeling distance between us, and I don't want to pretend I don't notice. I realize I haven't always made space for your feelings. I want to change that. I don't know exactly how to fix this, but I want to try, because you matter to me. Those small truths create ripples. They crack the shell you've built around your heart. And the person who's been pulling away, they'll feel it. They'll soften, not instantly, but steadily. Don't wait for a dramatic confrontation to force the truth out of you. Choose it now. Choose it while there's still time. Because once someone fully detaches, even your sincerest words might come too late. Gemini, you were born under an air sign, but that doesn't mean your love has to stay light as air. It can have gravity. It can have soul. But you have to allow it. Let this be your moment of reckoning. Not one of regret, but of redirection. Before we move on, I want you to sit for just 1 minute and breathe. Ask yourself, who am I afraid of losing right now? Who might already be halfway gone? And if your heart gives you an answer, listen. The universe brought you here for a reason, and the story is still being written. Gate 2, the Gemini defense. When charm becomes a disguise for emotional absence. Gemini, you have a gift, a radiant, mesmerizing presence that pulls people in. Your mind is fast, your humor quick, your stories enchanting. And without even trying, you become the sun around which others orbit. People love how you light up a room. But here's the question no one dares ask. Who sees you when the lights go out? There's a hidden loneliness in being everyone's favorite presence. Because often, it means you've learned to give just enough of yourself to be adored, but not enough to be known. The person in your life who is pulling away, they're not doing it because your charm has faded. They're doing it because they realize they've been talking to your performance, and not to your heart. This is where we go deeper. Gemini, in your search for acceptance, especially in earlier years, you may have learned to shapeshift, to mirror what others wanted, to speak in ways that would keep attention on you. But not too long, not too sharp. Perhaps, growing up, it felt dangerous to be too vulnerable. So you learned to be funny instead of heavy, clever instead of real. You found safety in sparkle. But no matter how magnetic the outside, we all long to be held for who we are inside. And someone close to you has grown weary of waiting for that unveiling. Let me tell you about Jalen, another Gemini I once guided through a very similar emotional terrain. Jalen had a longtime friend, Melissa, who adored him. They talked nearly every day, shared memes, gossip, and weekend plans. On the surface, they were inseparable. But when Melissa's father passed away, Jalen didn't know what to say. So instead of calling, he texted a lighthearted message to cheer her up. She didn't respond. He followed up with more jokes, trying to lift the mood. Eventually, she told him, "You're always fun, but right now I need someone who can sit with me in the dark." And just like that, the emotional gap revealed itself. Melissa wasn't asking Jalen to fix anything. She just wanted his presence, his realness, his quiet company in a time of grief. But Jalen had never learned how to just be. He'd only ever learned how to perform. This may feel familiar to you, Gemini, because in many of your relationships, the dynamics follow this pattern. You're adored, appreciated, even admired, but rarely deeply seen. Not because others didn't want to know you, but because you didn't let them. And here's the paradox. You think you're being rejected when someone grows distant, when in reality, they're simply retreating from the version of you that never let them in. Now, I know what you're thinking, but I'm always available. I show up, and you do. You show up with stories, with insights, with laughs. But do you show up with your sadness, with your anxiety, with the messy, unfiltered, unsure parts? Because the one pulling away from you, they're not asking for perfection. They're asking for truth. They want to know what you're afraid of, what keeps you up at night, what you wish someone would ask you, what you never told anyone because you were afraid it might be too much. Real intimacy, Gemini, doesn't come from talking. It comes from revealing. And right now, the person who's been drifting is doing so because they haven't felt that revelation from you. Not once, not fully. Let's be honest. You might be emotionally exhausted without even knowing it. Because keeping up a version of yourself that feels socially seamless, endlessly likable, and emotionally safe is draining. And part of you, deep down, may resent others for not seeing the strain you carry beneath the surface. But how can they see it if you've made it invisible? The tragedy of emotional performance is this. The better you are at it, the more alone you become. So, how do you stop the pattern? How do you change a dynamic that's been building quietly for months or years? You begin by unmasking, not dramatically, but sincerely. The next time you're with the person you sense is drifting, don't try to impress. Try to connect. Try this. I've been thinking a lot about how I show up in relationships. And I realize I've often tried to be what people want rather than just being me. Sometimes I use humor to avoid deeper stuff. But I want you to know that I care, even if I struggle to show it. You've probably noticed I keep things light, but I want to learn how to sit in the heavier moments, too, with you. You don't need a perfect speech. You just need to mean it. And when you do, when you allow even a crack of realness, the entire tone of the relationship will shift. It may feel awkward at first. The person may not know how to respond right away. That's okay. You're not doing this to get a certain response. You're doing it because you're tired of living behind a mirror. Gemini, there's a sacred beauty in letting someone hold your uncertainty. To admit, I don't know, instead of always being the guide. To say, I'm afraid. Instead of always being the one who lifts others up. To receive care, not just offer it. And when you do this, you'll notice something powerful. The people who truly love you won't run away from your mess. They'll lean in closer. The person who's slipping away right now, they may have just been waiting for this moment. Waiting to see if you'd risk being real. Waiting to feel your heart behind the conversation. If you reach out and they don't respond immediately, don't panic. Real intimacy takes rebuilding. Especially if your pattern has taught them not to expect emotional depth from you. Be patient. Be steady. Keep showing up, not with words, but with presence. One of the biggest myths in relationships is that conflict or silence ends love. In truth, it's the absence of emotional honesty that stars it. And you, dear Gemini, are standing at a crossroads. Continue performing or start revealing. There is nothing more magnetic than someone brave enough to be fully themselves. Let that be your new power. Not the wittiest line, not the smartest argument, but the courage to say, here I am. All of me, no filter. Let this be your turning point. Because the greatest love stories don't begin with charm. They begin with truth. Gate 3. When disconnection becomes a default and the Gemini learns to feel again. Gemini, let's go deeper now. Not into someone else's heart, but your own. Because this journey isn't just about saving a relationship that's slipping away. It's about rediscovering a part of yourself you've kept hidden for far too long. You see, when emotional disconnection becomes a default mode, when you become so used to light conversation and surface connection, you stop noticing how numb you become. You forget that you have needs too, that you have fears that deserve naming, that underneath your easygoing exterior, there are unspoken aches that never found their way into words. And that's what's been building inside you, Gemini. Not just a fear of losing someone, but the fear that you've lost touch with yourself. There's a moment in every life where we realize we've been holding back, not just from others, but from our own emotional experience. We distract ourselves. We stay busy. We think our way around the pain. We smile when we want to cry. We change the subject when our soul is screaming to be heard. Why? Because to feel fully seems too overwhelming, too inconvenient, too much. But Gemini, if you want love to return, real love, you must first return to your own heart. Let me share the story of Matteo, a Gemini man in his 50s who had lived most of his adult life as a social butterfly. He was always the one telling jokes at dinner parties, hosting game nights, making sure no one felt uncomfortable. People adored him. But when his teenage daughter began to emotionally withdraw, becoming quiet, uncommunicative, distant, he panicked. He tried everything. More cheerful texts, surprise outings, even motivational pep talks. But nothing worked. Finally, his daughter said through tears, "Dad, you never talk about what's real. I don't want jokes. I want to know you feel something." Those words shattered him. That night, Matteo sat with his own childhood for the first time in years. He remembered how his own father never expressed emotions, how his mother expected him to always be strong, how he'd been praised for being independent and smart, but never asked how he felt. And in that silence, he realized he had been parenting his daughter the same way he was raised, emotionally distant, though loving. This story isn't just Matteo's. It's yours too, Gemini, because underneath your airy ease is often a deep legacy of emotional suppression. Not because you're incapable of feeling, but because feeling wasn't modeled, welcomed, or made safe. And so, you adapted. You became lighthearted. You became agreeable. You became likable. You became the version of yourself that kept things moving. But now, someone you love is no longer content with that version. And quietly, neither are you. There's a truth you've been avoiding, Gemini. Emotional safety doesn't come from control. It comes from truth. And truth is not always smooth. It's raw. It's messy. It doesn't always make sense. But it heals. This week, you may notice a strange heaviness in your body, a tiredness that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from emotional fatigue. That's your heart telling you it's time to reconnect. You've been so good at adapting to others' needs that you've forgotten to check in with your own. Ask yourself, when was the last time I cried without shame? When was the last time I shared something I didn't fully understand about myself? When was the last time I asked for comfort without making it a joke? These aren't questions designed to make you feel guilty. They're invitations. Invitations to come back home to your emotional center. Because here's the cosmic truth. No one is pulling away from you because you're broken. They're pulling away because they crave the parts of you you've hidden. The parts that feel, the parts that hurt, the parts that hope. You've given so much of your energy to keeping things easy that you've forgotten relationships were never meant to be easy. They were meant to be real. Gemini, real love begins where masks fall. And right now, the person who's distancing themselves may not even realize consciously why they're doing it. They just feel empty in your presence. Not because you are empty, but because you're withholding the part of you that connects soul to soul, your vulnerability. Maybe you fear that if you start showing more emotion, you'll be seen as needy, or weak, or dramatic. But let me tell you something with absolute certainty. True emotional strength isn't about being unshakable. It's about being honest with what shakes you and choosing to keep showing up anyway. Emotional presence is a skill, Gemini, one you can learn, one you were always meant to master. It starts by breaking your default responses. The next time someone you love opens up about something real, pause. Don't rush to give advice. Don't make a joke. Don't try to move the energy. Just sit, listen, feel. Let their words echo inside your chest instead of bouncing off your mind. And when it's your turn to speak, don't default to fine, busy, or it's nothing. Try something like, that really touched something I've been carrying too. I'm not used to talking about this, But here's what I've been feeling lately. I'm scared I don't know how to be close anymore, but I want to try. You will stumble. You will feel exposed. But you will also feel alive. And the person who's been drifting, they may slowly, cautiously begin to orbit you again. Not because you charm them, but because you move them. That's the difference, Gemini. Surface connection entertains. Emotional presence transforms. You don't have to change who you are. Your intelligence, your wit, your playfulness. Those are all part of your soul's beauty. But it's time to include the other half. The soft side. The messy stories. The parts of you that don't always have the right words. The deeper you go into your own truth, the more love becomes possible. Not just return love, but lasting love. You spent so much time protecting yourself from potential rejection that you've accidentally rejected the very closeness you crave. Now is the time to reverse that pattern. The silence between you and this person isn't a punishment. It's an invitation, a holy pause from the universe, asking you, will you stay at the surface or will you dive into the soul? You know the answer. Gate 4. From harmony to honesty, dismantling the illusion of keeping the peace. Gemini, you've always known how to maintain harmony. You're the peacemaker in the room, the diffuser of tension, the one who knows exactly what to say to keep things light and flowing. But here's a sacred truth the universe wants you to hear. There is a difference between keeping peace and creating it. The illusion you've carried, possibly your entire life, is that if you avoid conflict, if you steer clear of heavy topics, if you keep everyone laughing, everything will stay whole. But sometimes, Gemini, what seems like harmony is actually just silence. And that silence is often filled with things unsaid, needs unmet, truths ignored. The person who is slowly pulling away from you, they've been feeling that silence for a long time. At first, they accepted it as your way. Maybe they even admired your lightheartedness, your ability to not make things heavy. But over time, that absence of depth started to feel like an absence of them. They realized they couldn't bring all of themselves into the space between you because you weren't bringing all of you. And when that happens, Gemini, no matter how much laughter or attention you offer, the bond begins to thin until it becomes transparent, until it breaks. Let's pause here because I want to tell you something you may never have heard enough in your life. You don't have to be agreeable all the time to be loved. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of someone staying. You don't have to carry a constant smile to keep someone's heart close. The person who's walking away isn't asking for peace. They're asking for presence, for participation, for your truth, even when it's awkward, even when it's messy. Think of it this way. A relationship that never encounters tension isn't strong. It's fragile. It means there's no room for realness, no room for disagreement, no room for growth. And sooner or later, someone will outgrow that cage of calmness. This is where your soul is being asked to rise, Gemini, not to impress, not to protect, but to engage, to let your voice shake if it needs to say the thing you've been too afraid to say, to ask the question you've been dodging for weeks. In one of my sessions, I met with Leanne, a Gemini woman who had spent years trying to avoid conflict in her marriage. She thought, if I don't rock the boat, we'll stay afloat. But her husband began pulling away emotionally. He stopped asking how her day was. He started staying later at work. One day, he said, I feel like I'm living with a roommate, not a partner. That night, Leanne did something terrifying. She said, I'm afraid you're leaving emotionally, and I don't know how to reach you anymore. I've avoided saying this because I didn't want to create drama, but silence is creating more damage than honesty ever could. For the first time in years, they had a real conversation. Tears, shaking voices, long pauses, but also relief, because they finally said the truth out loud. And in that honesty, they found a deeper kind of peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of connection. Gemini, this is a path in front of you now. You may feel tempted to wait, to hope this all passes, that the distance closes on its own. But the truth is, the longer you wait to speak, the deeper the gap becomes. Not just between you and the other person, but between you and your own integrity. Silence is not always golden. Sometimes, silence is abandonment in disguise. And don't be fooled. Your charm, your intellect, your light are still gifts. But the person you love doesn't want to be entertained. They want to be met. They want to look at you and see all of you, not just a version that knows how to keep everything running smoothly. So, how do you begin to break this pattern of peacekeeping? You practice brave honesty. You sit down with a person who's been drifting and you say something like, "I've been avoiding some important conversations because I was afraid of ruining things. But now I see the silence has done more harm than any truth could. I know I've been emotionally distant. That's not because I don't care. It's because I'm scared. But I don't want fear to run this relationship anymore. Can we have a real conversation? One where we both bring our full selves?" This won't always go perfectly. Sometimes they won't know how to respond. Sometimes they'll need space to process. But your honesty will open a doorway that charm never could. And whether or not the relationship is saved, you will have done the most important thing of all. You will have shown up for real. You will have chosen authenticity over avoidance. You will have traded performance for participation. And Gemini, you will have finally let your soul breathe. One of your superpowers is duality. You are not just a talker. You are the thinker, the feeler, the complex mosaic of contradiction. And it's time to let all of you into your relationships, not just the polished parts. Because the person who is pulling away, they're not asking you to be more like them. They're asking you to be more like you, the unfiltered, courageous, emotionally available version you've been hiding behind laughter and logic. This isn't about saving the relationship at any cost. It's about ending the cycle of silence. It's about deciding that you're no longer willing to lose love in exchange for keeping things comfortable. Comfort zones are cozy, but nothing grows there. Growth lives in honest conversations, in trembling voices, in raw truths spoken from the heart. You can still turn this around, but only if you're willing to let go of the version of you that never speaks up. Are you? Because if you are, what comes next might not be easy, but it will be real. Gate 5, the courage to be real, rebuilding through vulnerability, not perfection. Gemini, we've walked through silence, avoidance, emotional distance, and the illusion of peace. Now we arrive at the most powerful threshold of all, your choice to rebuild, not through performance, but through presence. It's not too late, despite the distance, despite the signs, despite the ache that's grown quietly in the space between you and the person you're afraid to lose. The story is not finished, but the next chapter can be written with the same pen you've been using, because the old pen, the one filled with charm, humor, clever words, and deflection, won't write intimacy. It only sketches outlines of connection, never coloring in the depth. And right now, the person pulling away from you is no longer satisfied with outlines. They want to live in full color. With you, here's the truth most Geminis resist until the moment of no return. You cannot intellectualize your way back into someone's heart. You have to feel your way there. You have to show them the parts of you that don't have the answers, the parts that still hurt, the parts that are willing to say, "I don't know how to fix this, but I care enough to try." Let's be clear. Vulnerability is not a tactic. It is not a strategy to win someone back. It's not a carefully placed confession meant to elicit a specific response. If you show up raw just to save the relationship, the other person will feel that manipulation instantly. But if you show up raw because you're done pretending, because you finally understand that closeness only comes from truth, then something shifts. Even if they don't rush back, even if the outcome remains uncertain, you will have realigned with your own soul. Let me share with you the story of Natalia, a Gemini in her late 30s. Her partner, Casey, had begun to emotionally withdraw. They still shared space, but not presence. Conversations felt like reruns. Affection was rare. And worst of all, Natalia felt invisible. She told herself all the usual Gemini stories. "We're both busy. This will pass. It's probably just a phase." But eventually, she couldn't deny it anymore. One evening, she looked at Casey and said, "I think we're losing each other, and I don't know how to stop it." Casey, startled but quiet, finally said, "I've felt that too. But every time I try to go deeper with you, it felt like you bounce away, like you were afraid to let me all the way in. Natalia broke down. She admitted that she had always feared being a burden, that in past relationships, being too much had cost her everything. So she made herself small, easy, undemanding. She had trained herself not to need too much from anyone, including him. That night, for the first time in months, they didn't fall asleep side by side in silence. They stayed up until dawn, talking, crying, laughing through tears. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but honestly. That conversation didn't magically solve everything, but it was a turning point. Because when someone is drifting, the thing that pulls them back isn't pressure. It's presence. It's being witnessed in your rawness and still being met with care. Gemini, what if the person pulling away from you isn't gone, but simply waiting? Waiting for you to show up as yourself, not your public self, not your peacemaker self, but the real, trembling, emotionally awake version of you that you've kept tucked away. This is your moment, not to prove anything, not to fix everything, but to feel everything, to look them in the eye and say, I miss you. I see that something's changed, and I've been scared to admit it. I know I've kept part of myself guarded. I want to learn how to let you in. And then listen. Don't defend. Don't intellectualize. Just stay. Because the real magic happens not in the perfect speech, but in the imperfect silence that follows vulnerability. That moment when you choose not to run. When you stay emotionally present, even if the air feels heavy. This is not just about them. Gemini, this is about you. You've gone so long being light that you've forgotten what it feels like to be held. But you deserve to be held, not just celebrated. You deserve to be understood, not just admired. You deserve a love that knows you, not just a version of you that everyone likes. And the only way to have that is to risk being real. So, in the coming days, here's what I ask of you. Don't wait for the perfect moment. There isn't one. Create one. Don't try to prepare a perfect script. Speak from your truth in the moment. Don't expect immediate results. Rebuilding trust takes time, but vulnerability plants the seed. And if they've already pulled away too far, if they don't come back, then let your vulnerability become your path forward. Not a wound, but a wisdom. Not a loss, but a learning. Because when you finally show up as all of you, you stop attracting half-hearted relationships. You start calling in people who want to meet you on the soul level, not just the social level. Gemini, your journey now is not to hold on tighter. It's to open wider. Wider to truth. Wider to pain. Wider to the kind of love that doesn't need you to perform, but invites you to rest, to be seen, to be accepted. This is your revolution, not in your mind, in your heart. And I promise, once you cross this threshold of realness, you will never go back to the smallness of surface again. Conclusion, from disconnection to devotion, the journey home to yourself. Gemini, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I know your heart is awake now, perhaps a little shaken, but more alive than it was before. And that's the first miracle. Because the path from loss to liberation doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins with awareness, with finally saying, yes, something's been wrong, and I'm ready to meet it with truth. You have been carrying the weight of keeping everything together, trying to stay light, trying not to cause waves. But in the name of harmony, you've silenced your own soul, and that silence is what created the distance you're now desperate to reverse. But here's what I want you to remember, always. You are not too late. You are not too broken. And you are absolutely capable of creating intimacy, not the kind that is polished and pleasing, but the kind that is honest, unfiltered, and fiercely alive. You've already begun. By acknowledging what you've been avoiding, you've cracked open the door to healing. Now, you must walk through it. You've moved from denial to recognition, from numbness to vulnerability, from control to surrender. This is your emotional graduation. And the person pulling away, they may just be waiting for you to show them the real you, not the safe you, not the edited you, but the brave, beautifully imperfect soul that's always been longing to be loved for exactly who they are. So speak the truth, risk the tension, be seen. And remember this, your loyalty is a gift, not an obligation. Your voice is sacred, not something to censor. Your realness is not a flaw. It's the very key to the connection you crave. If this message stirred something in you, I invite you to share in the comments. Your story might help someone else find their own courage. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Esoteric Wisdom, where these conversations continue, and where your healing always has a home. The future of this connection lies not in who you pretend to be, but in who you finally allow yourself to become.